The morning Ursa Ironblood told Isaac Keller she would be gone by spring, he nodded slowly, set down his tin cup of black coffee, and walked out to the frost-hardened earth behind his cabin and began measuring rows with a length of knotted rope. She watched him from the doorway, her broad green hand resting against the rough-hewn doorframe, and she did not know what to make of it. She had been clear. She had looked him straight in the eyes, those quiet brown eyes that never flinched when they met hers, which was rare enough in this part of the frontier to be unsettling. And she had told him plainly that she would leave when the thaw came. She had business in the eastern clanholds. She had people who expected her. She had a life that had nothing to do with a solitary human farmer sitting at the edge of the graywood with a leaking roof and a stubborn mule. He had nodded, and then he had gone out to plan a garden. Isaac Keller was 28 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men on the frontier always were, with calloused hands and a jaw dusted with a week of dark stubble, and eyes that looked as though they had been watching horizons so long they had gone permanently soft and searching. He was not a complicated man in the way that people sometimes mean that as an insult. He was not simple either. He was the kind of man who noticed things, the lean of a fence post before it gave way, the smell of weather changing, the way a person held their breath when they thought no one was paying attention. He noticed everything about Ursa Ironblood. She had come to his property in the deep of autumn, which felt like a lifetime ago even though it had been less than 5 months. She had come through the tree line at dusk, walking with a slight hitch in her left side that she was trying very hard to hide, and Isaac had been on the porch splitting kindling, and he had seen her and gone still. He had heard stories about orcs, of course. Everyone in the frontier settlements had. The stories ranged from the merely suspicious to the wildly untrue, and Isaac had grown up skeptical of stories told by frightened people, because frightened people have a habit of filling in what they do not understand with whatever their fear suggests. What he saw coming across his field in the failing light was a woman. A large woman, taller than him by several inches, built powerfully through the shoulders and chest, with dark green skin and dark hair that was matted and tangled from what had clearly been days of hard travel. Her lower canines were visible even at a distance, slightly longer than a human's, curving up past her lip in that distinctive way. She was wearing traveling leathers and a heavy cloak that had seen better years, and she was bleeding. Isaac set down his axe and went to meet her. That was the part she had never quite been able to reckon with, even now. He had not gone inside. He had not reached for a weapon. He had walked toward her across the browning grass of his field like she was a neighbor who'd had a bad fall from a horse, and the first thing he had said was, "You are hurt. Come inside." Not a question, an invitation, just that. Ursa had stood there in the half-dark and stared at him, and she had been so exhausted and so far past the edge of her endurance that she had not had anything left in her to argue with. She had followed him inside. The wound in her side was a long gash from a knife, not life-threatening but badly infected from days of rough travel without proper care. Isaac had cleaned it with the steady, unhurried competence of a man who had lived alone long enough to know how to take care of injuries by himself, and he had done it without grimacing, without recoiling, without any of the dozen small expressions that humans showed when they were uncomfortable with closeness to someone like her. He had just worked, he had given her his bed, he had slept by the fire, she had planned to leave in 3 days. The 3 days had stretched into a week, and the week into a month because the first frost came hard that year, and then a storm, and then she had found herself one morning mending his fence beside him because she had seen it leaning and it had bothered her. And somewhere in the mending of the fence, a month became 2, and 2 became 3, and now it was the cold deep of winter and she was living in Isaac Keller's cabin like she had always meant to be there. She had not meant to be there. She needed to be clear about that, even to herself, which was why she had told him clearly and plainly that she would leave come spring, and he had gone out to plan a garden. The rope he used was an old one, frayed at one end and patched with a different color cord at the other, and he moved along the ground in careful, deliberate lines, crouching every few feet to press his fingers into the frozen earth like he was reading something written there. Ursa watched him for a long time from the doorway. The cold came through the open door and curled around her ankles, and the cabin behind her smelled of pine smoke and the last of last night's dinner, a rabbit stew she had made because his cooking, while earnest, was catastrophic. She pulled her borrowed wool shawl tighter and finally called out, "What are you doing?" He looked up. His breath misted in the cold air. "Planning," he said. "I told you I am leaving in spring." "I know," he said. He looked back down at the ground and shifted the rope slightly. "Beans want more light on the eastern side. I always put them wrong." Ursa stared at him. He was perfectly serious. He had the expression of a man who was genuinely thinking about beans. She went back inside and stood by the fire and tried to feel the irritation she had expected to feel and found something else there instead. Something that felt uncomfortably like being seen through. Isaac Keller had a talent for that. The cabin itself was a good one, she had decided, even by orc standards of what made a home defensible and sound. He had built it himself, or rather he had built most of it himself and inherited the original walls from whoever had lived here before, some previous settler who had given up or died or moved on, as settlers on the frontier tended to do. The walls were thick, the chimney drew well, and the roof only leaked in one corner, which he had patched with tar and bark, and which she had reinforced with clay she had found along the creek bank in the first weeks before the ground froze. He had not asked her to do it. She had done it because it needed doing. The interior was spare in the way of a man who had been living alone long enough that he no longer thought about what a home should look like. There was the single bed, a heavy wooden frame with a straw mattress that she had eventually taken over entirely, not because he had offered it, but because, after 2 weeks on the floor, he had developed such an obvious ache in his back that she had simply ordered him out of the blankets by the fire and back into the bed, an argument he had lost in under a minute. There was a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of basic supplies, a few worn books, a rack of tools, and a workbench near the window that he used for repairs. Ursa had added a second hook by the door for her cloak and a low stool near the fire for sitting, because she was too long in the leg to sit comfortably in his chairs, and he had not said a word about either addition. He had also not said a word the morning she had rearranged his storage shelf, or when she had rehung his drying rack at a height that was useful to her rather than him, or when she had taken over the cooking entirely after a memorable incident involving burned cornmeal that she still did not entirely understand how he had managed. He had just watched her make herself at home in his home and said nothing, and his eyes had that look in them, that soft and searching look, and she had told herself it was simply the look of a man who was too polite to complain. She was not certain she believed that anymore. Ursa Ironblood was 25 years old. She had been born in one of the eastern clanholds to a mother who was a trader and a father who had died in a border dispute before she was old enough to remember his face. She had grown up with the clanhold's particular mixture of pride and practicality, learning to track and hunt and negotiate and fight in equal measure, and she had left at 19 to make her own way because she was the kind of person the clanhold found difficult to contain. She was not a warrior by choice, though she was capable. She was a traveler and a trader, someone who moved between worlds, between orc clanholds and human settlements, and the strange in-between places where the two rubbed up against each other. She had been coming back from one of those in-between places when she had been robbed on the road 3 days east of here. 4 men, human, the kind who thought that a lone orc woman on a back road was an easy mark. They had taken her pack, her trading goods, her coin, and given her the knife wound in her side before she had persuaded them otherwise. She had persuaded them thoroughly enough that they would not be robbing anyone else for a considerable time, but she had still been left on a back road in the early autumn cold with nothing but what she was wearing and a wound that was already starting to sour. And then she had crossed a field toward a light in the dark, and a human man with calloused hands had walked toward her without fear. She had not been planning to stay. She was not planning to stay. She had responsibilities, obligations, people who would wonder where she was. The spring would come and the road would open, and she would go back to her life, which was a life that she was very good at and that suited her. She stood by the fire in Isaac Keller's cabin and listened to him moving around outside in the cold, staking out the lines of a garden he was planting for a spring that she kept telling herself she would not be there to see, and she felt something she did not have a word for in any language she spoke. Winter on the frontier had its own particular quality of intimacy. When the world outside closed down under ice and snow, and the days shortened to a few gray hours of weak light, the interior of a cabin became the whole world, and the people in it became deeply acquainted with each other in ways that felt inevitable rather than chosen. Isaac and Ursa had fallen into this intimacy, the way two people fall into a conversation they had not planned on having, slowly and then all at once. They talked in the evenings. This had surprised her. Isaac was quiet on the surface, economical with words in the way of people who had spent a lot of time alone, but he was not closed. When she spoke, he listened with his whole body, turning toward her the way a plant turns toward light, and when he spoke he said things that were worth hearing. He told her about growing up in a river town a week's ride south, his father's mill, his two brothers who had both stayed and built lives there, while Isaac had felt the pull of something else, something open and uncontained. He had come north to this piece of land 4 years ago with a mule, a cart of tools, and a map that had turned out to be somewhat optimistic about the distances involved. She told him about the clan holds, the way they worked, the intricate web of obligation and honor and trade that held them together. She told him about her mother, who was still alive and still trading and still exasperated by Ursa's inability to settle. She told him about the goods she had been carrying when she was robbed, spices from the coast and worked metal from a dwarf settlement to the south, meant for the clanhold's autumn market, and the money she had expected to bring back that she no longer had. He had listened to that part carefully and then had said quietly, "I can give you what I can spare of the spring sales if it helps, when the road opens." She had stared at him. Why would you do that? He had looked at her for a moment in a way that made her feel like the question was somehow both obvious and impossible to answer. "Because you lost it helping people trade," he had said simply. "Seems like it should be made right somehow. I am not your responsibility. I know. I am leaving in spring. I know that too." The evenings by the fire stretched long. She discovered that he read, which was not something she had expected, and that his tastes ran to practical things, farming guides and surveying manuals, and a single battered volume of frontier stories that she had picked up one evening out of curiosity and had not been able to put down for 3 days. He had watched her read it with an expression she had needed time to interpret. She read to him sometimes, which had started by accident when she had been reading aloud to herself, and realized he had stopped working at the bench and was listening. She had sharp eyes and could read easily in firelight, and his eyes were beginning to show the early strain of men who worked outdoors in all weathers, and she had simply kept reading. He never asked her to stop. He never asked her to keep going either. He just listened, and she read, and the fire burned down, and the wind moved around the outside of the cabin, and the world outside was very cold and very far away. She learned that he woke before dawn every day, without fail, that he moved quietly in the dark so as not to wake her, that he always checked on the mule first thing, and then built the fire up before starting on anything else. She learned that he had a habit of talking to the mule when he thought no one was listening, long and apparently one-sided conversations about the day's work, and that the mule's name was Bramble, and that Bramble appeared to hold Isaac in profound contempt, which Isaac accepted with good humor. She learned that he was not afraid of silence, that he could sit in it for an hour without discomfort, and that this made him rare. She learned that he looked at her sometimes when he thought she could not see, and that the expression on his face when he did was one she had no experience interpreting and no framework for, because no human had ever looked at her that way before. She told herself she was not paying attention to that. The winter deepened. There was a stretch of 3 weeks in January when the snow came and did not stop, piling up against the cabin walls to the height of the lower window, and making going outside an event that required real effort and planning. They spent those weeks in close quarters so continuous that Ursa expected to become irritable with him, and did not. She waited for the moment she would want distance, and it did not come. She had lived her whole life in the dense social fabric of a trading clanhold, people always present and always in motion, and then years of solitary travel, and she had believed herself to be someone who needed movement and space and could not bear to be still. Isaac Keller's cabin in the winter was still in a way that should have felt like a trap. It felt, infuriatingly, like rest. One evening during the deepest part of that stretch, when the wind was picking up outside and making sounds like something trying to get in, she had come back from the outhouse to find him adding something to the fire, and she had stood in the doorway for a moment looking at him, at the familiar angle of his back, and the way the firelight moved across his shoulders, and the completely ordinary way he occupied his own space. And she had felt something move through her so strongly that she had to press her hand against the doorframe. She went to bed before he noticed. She lay awake for a long time listening to the wind. February came in gray and brutal. The mule got sick, and they spent 3 nights in the barn with Bramble, taking shifts keeping her warm and watching her breathing. And on the 3rd night, when the mule's fever finally broke and she stood up on her own 4 feet with an expression of supreme indignation, Isaac had sat back in the straw with relief so profound it was almost comical, and Ursa had laughed, really laughed, for the first time in a long time, and he had looked at her, and the look on his face had not been comical at all. "What?" she had said. He had shaken his head. "Nothing." He had a way of smiling that started small and spread slowly like ice thawing. "I have just never heard you laugh like that before." "Do not make it a thing," she had said. "I am not making it anything." But he was still looking at her. She had pulled her knees up and looked away. Outside the barn the wind was moving through the trees, and somewhere in the graywood something owlish called out once and went quiet. "Isaac," she said. "Yes. I am still leaving in spring." The pause was so brief she almost missed it. "I know," he said. She looked back at him then. He was looking at Bramble, who was noisily investigating a pile of hay as though nothing unusual had happened, and his expression was entirely composed, and she studied his profile in the lantern light and felt the full weight of her own confusion settle down on her shoulders like a pack she had not agreed to carry. He was not trying to change her mind. That was the thing that confounded her. Most people, when they wanted something, pushed. They argued or pleaded or maneuvered. They made their case. Isaac Keller was not making a case. He was just continuing to exist in the same space as her, continuing to build his fence and keep his fire and plan his garden, and he was not asking anything of her except what she had already given, which was her presence, and even that he seemed to hold carefully, like something that might break if he gripped it too hard. It made her furious in a way she could not explain to herself. The first sign of thaw came in early March, a few days of warmer air that turned the top inch of snow to mush before freezing again overnight. The world did not look hopeful yet, but it smelled different, something underneath the cold and pine, like earth remembering what it knew how to do. Isaac went out on the first decent morning and brought back the knotted rope and the flat stones he had left marking his row lines and laid them out on the cabin floor, and then he sat at the table with a piece of paper and a stick of charcoal and began drawing. She watched him from the fire where she was stirring a pot of oats. "You are mapping the garden," she said, "trying to remember where I put things last year." He frowned at the paper. "I put the squash where the shade hit wrong. Everything came up yellow. Squash wants eastern morning light and afternoon shade," she said without thinking. He looked up. "How do you know that?" "My mother grows squash. She is very particular about it." She paused. "The beans you mentioned before, early spring or late." I have been doing late, but the Harkness place down the valley does early and gets a better crop. Do early with the beans, she said. Start them inside if you have the window space. He was looking at her with that expression again. She turned back to the oats. Where on the eastern side of the garden would you put them? He said. She ladled oats into both bowls, brought them to the table, sat across from him and looked at his rough map. She took the charcoal from his fingers, which were rough and warm when they briefly touched hers, and she drew a line. Here, she said. Beans here, squash here, root vegetables along this back line where the water runs a little slow. If you dig a drainage channel here, it will help with the spring flooding. He was watching her hand on the paper. You have done this before, he said. I have helped my mother. I used to come home between roots and stay a season. She put the charcoal down. I have not done that in 3 years. Do you miss it? The question was plain and sincere, the way his questions always were, no edges or implications hidden in them. She considered the truthful answer, which was more complicated than yes or no. I miss her, she said. I do not miss the clanhold the way it makes you feel like you should be one thing and stay that thing. He nodded slowly. He understood that in his bones, she thought, he had left his family's mill for the same reason. The Eastern Road, she said, looking at the map rather than at him, will open about 4 weeks after the last hard frost. When it opens, I should go. I know, he said. Isaac, he looked at her. His eyes were very steady. Why are you planting a garden for a spring you know I will not be here for? She asked. The silence was long enough that she thought he would not answer. Because I need to eat, he said finally, and there was something in his voice that was perfectly ordinary on the surface and something else underneath, something that she could hear if she listened the way she had learned to listen to him over these months, and she heard it clearly. She looked at him for a long moment. She picked up her oats and ate them. They did not talk about the garden again that day, but the next morning she was outside with him, crouched over the half-thawed earth, and she was holding one end of the knotted rope while he pulled it taut to mark the first row. March moved through its cold moods. There were more good days, and the snow retreated from all but the shadowed places under the trees, and the creek thawed with considerable noise and enthusiasm, and threatened to jump its banks for a few days before settling back down. Isaac began bringing seeds out in the evenings, sorting them in small paper envelopes with his handwriting on each one, the letters large and deliberate, the hand of someone who had not spent a lot of years with pen and paper. Ursa sat across the table and watched him sort and was struck by a sudden and specific vision of this table in summer, with the window open and the sounds of everything growing coming through, and the seeds all in the ground and Isaac's rough hands wrapped around a cup of evening tea. She could see it as clearly as if it were already happening, and the clarity of it scared her. She thought about the Eastern Road. She thought about her mother, who would want to know she was alive. She thought about the clanhold where people knew her name and knew her history and expected certain things of her. She thought about the rhythm of her life before this winter, the movement, the trade, the freedom of being always in motion. She thought about a table in summer with the window open. She was restless for the next several days in a way that made her sharper-edged than usual, and Isaac noticed, of course he noticed, and he gave her more space without being obvious about it, which irritated her because she did not want more space, which irritated her further because she did not know what she wanted. On a Saturday afternoon, she went out and split a cord of wood that did not need splitting, and Isaac sat on the porch steps and watched her and did not say a single word. And when she finally stopped, breathing hard and sweating despite the cold, she turned to look at him, and he was watching her with that expression that she had spent all winter not being able to name. "Say something," she said. "You have a very good form," he said, nodding at the axe. "Straight through the center." She stared at him. "You are maddening," she said. He blinked. "I am sorry. No, you are not." She stuck the axe in the chopping block and came to the porch and stood in front of him and looked down at him, because he was still sitting on the step and she was taller than him, even standing on the same level, and his face was turned up toward her in the afternoon light, and he looked calm and steady and entirely himself, and she said, "You knew I would stay." He did not say yes. He did not say no. He just looked at her with those quiet brown eyes and said, "I hoped you might." She sat down on the step beside him, their shoulders close but not touching, and they both looked out across the field where the snow had pulled back to leave brown winter grass, and beyond it the beginning of the garden rows marked with flat stones and the stakes she had helped him drive. "I still have to go back," she said, "to the clan hold. My mother does not know if I am alive." "I know," he said. "That is not the same thing as staying." "I know that too." She was quiet for a while. The afternoon light was going golden at the edges, and a pair of crows was making opinions known in the tree line, and Bramble could be heard shuffling in the barn. "What if I came back?" she said. It came out before she had quite decided to say it, and she felt the weight of it in the air between them. Isaac was very still for a moment. Then he said, carefully, as if he was handling something fragile, "What would that look like?" "I do not know," she said honestly. "I have never done this before, any of this." "Neither have I," he said. She looked at him. He meant it. He was not a man who had been doing this, building towards something with practiced ease. He was a man who had simply been honest, simply been himself, and somehow that had amounted to something. "I would need to go," she said. "Bring my mother news, settle things, return what I can of what was owed." "Yes." "That could take months." "Yes. And then I might come back. I am not promising anything." She heard how cold that sounded and pushed forward anyway because she needed him to understand she was not making a promise she could not keep. "I am not a person who can promise a thing like that before I have lived it." "I am not asking you to promise," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Then what are you asking?" He looked down at his hands, the big calloused hands that had cleaned her wound without flinching and built the fire before she woke and held the other end of the rope while she measured garden rows, and he said very quietly, "I suppose I am just asking you to think about whether you might want to come back. While you are gone, think about it." Ursa looked at the stakes and the stones and the marked-out rows of the garden he had planned all winter. She thought about beans in eastern morning light and squash turned away from the afternoon shadow. She thought about the root vegetables along the back line where the drainage would help. She thought about who had planned all of that. "I will think about it," she said. He nodded once. He did not smile. He did not reach for her. He just nodded, like a man who had been given something small and was going to be careful with it. The weeks between that conversation and the opening of the eastern road were strange in a way that Ursa could not have predicted. Something had shifted between them, acknowledged now in a way it had not been before, and it had changed the quality of the air in the cabin, made the evenings both easier and harder. Easier because she was no longer fighting against the recognition of what she felt. Harder because now that she had stopped fighting it, she felt it more plainly, and the road was still going to open and she was still going to walk it. They started the beans indoors. This was her doing, setting a flat of good soil in the window where it got the best light, pressing the seeds in one by one. Isaac watched her do it and then came and pressed the last half row beside her, their hands moving in the same window light, the soil dark and damp on both their fingers. "You have to water them consistently," she said. "Not too much, just keep the soil from drying." "I know how to water things," he said mildly. "You also thought the squash wanted full sun. That was a judgment error." She looked sideways at him. He was close enough that she could see the individual lashes at the corner of his eye, and the way the light coming through the old glass caught the deeper warm tones in what looked from a distance like simple brown hair. He was looking at the bean flat with complete concentration, carefully patting the soil, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last time that day, that he was the most quietly remarkable person she had ever met. She did not say that. She said, "Check the beans every morning, move the flat if the light shifts." "I will," he said. The road opened on a Thursday. She knew because the Harkness family from down the valley came by on a wagon, the first people they had seen in months, and old Greta Harkness shouted from the road that the ford was passable and the mud had firmed up enough to travel. She waved at them from the porch and Greta waved back, and the wagon moved on and Ursa stood looking at the road for a long moment. She packed that afternoon. She did not have much. What she had when she arrived had been lost, and what she had now was what she had slowly accumulated over a winter in Isaac's orbit, which was not much but felt heavier than it should have. A change of clothes, her knives, a few useful tools he insisted she take, a small wrapped parcel that he pressed into her hands on the morning she left, and which she discovered later contained dried meat and hardtack and a small folded paper on which he had written, in his large, deliberate letters, only her name and then a blank space below it, that she understood to mean something she did not have words for yet. She found the paper when she was 2 hours down the road, sitting on a fallen log to rest her feet, and she held it for a long time. She folded it again and put it in the inner pocket of her cloak, against her chest. The road to the eastern clanholds was 4 days on foot, longer than it should have been because the spring mud was unpredictable and twice she had to take long ways around flooded sections, and she spent the nights in travelers' waste stops, crude shelters left by courtesy for people making the passage, dry firewood already stacked, and a crude hearth. She sat by those fires in the evenings and thought about what she had told him she would think about. She thought about it. She thought about it carefully and in every dimension she could identify, trying to account for the things that made it complicated, and the things that made it simple, and the places where complicated and simple overlapped. She was an orc woman. He was a human man. The world they lived in had opinions about that, strong and frequently voiced opinions, and she had spent enough time in human settlements to know that those opinions came with real weight. There would be people who would not accept her regardless of what she built or how long she stayed, people who would look at his cabin and see only that the wrong kind of person lived there. Isaac knew this as well as she did. Probably better in some ways because it was his world and he had grown up in it, and he had still planned a garden. She reached the clanhold on a gray afternoon, coming through the outer gate with the smell of cook fires and the sound of voices she knew from childhood filling the air around her, and she felt the particular mix of belonging and restlessness that this place always gave her, and she also felt, clearly and undeniably, that there was somewhere she wanted to go back to. Her mother was a compact, formidable woman named Vesa who had her daughter's dark eyes and no patience for abstractions. When Ursa came through the gate and found her mother in the market square, Vesa had crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and held her daughter by the shoulders and looked at her face for a long, silent moment. "You are alive," she said. "I told you I would be. You also told me you would be back in autumn." Her mother's grip on her shoulders did not loosen. "There is a line of gray in my hair that was not there in autumn. There is also a new vendor in the corner stall," Ursa said. "You have been busy." Vesa released her with a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a scold and pulled her toward home, and Ursa went, and the clanhold wrapped around her with all of its familiar weight. She told her mother everything. This was not a thing she had planned to do, not all of it, but Vesa had a way of asking questions that made the full truth more efficient than the partial version. And so, she told her about the robbery and the wound and the field in the autumn dark, and the human man who had walked toward her without fear. Her mother listened with the expression she always wore when she was hearing something important, very still and very focused. "He is a farmer," she said when Ursa finished. "Yes. On the frontier alone, yes, and he spent all winter planning a garden knowing you intended to leave." "Yes," Ursa said. Vesa was quiet for a moment. "What is his land like?" Ursa blinked. "What, the soil, is it good, south-facing enough for a real growing season?" "Mother, I am asking a practical question," Vesa said, entirely without irony. "The soil is good, better than most in that valley. He has a water source, a solid structure, enough cleared land for a real farm if someone were to work it properly." She paused. "He works it well. He is not a man who does things carelessly." "No," her mother said. "He does not sound like it." She stayed in the clanhold for 2 months. She settled the debt from the lost goods, which her mother helped with, not as a gift, but as a formal trading advance that Ursa would pay back over the next season, an arrangement both practical and face-saving that was typical of her mother's methods. She repaired relationships with the Clanhold's trade network, reconnected with people she had not seen in years, and let the familiar rhythms of the place settle around her. She also found, after about 3 weeks, that she was sleeping badly. She lay on her familiar pallet in her mother's house and stared at the familiar ceiling and listened to the familiar sounds of the Clanhold at night, and she thought about a fire in a small stone hearth and the sound of wind around a cabin and a man who said, "I hoped you might," with such careful quietness that she still felt it sometimes, right under her collarbone, pressing. She wrote him a letter in May, which required borrowing a paper and pen from the Clanhold's record keeper and sitting for an embarrassingly long time staring at the blank page before she wrote anything. When she finally wrote, she wrote simply. She told him she had arrived safely. She told him her mother was well and in vigorous health and had asked about his soil. She told him she hoped the beans had come up. She told him she had thought about what he had asked her to think about. She did not write what she had concluded. She did not think paper was the right place for that. She folded the letter and sent it with a trader going west, hoping it would reach him, not sure it would, not sure what she expected from sending it. 3 weeks later, through the same trader coming back east, she received a folded paper that had her name on the front in large, deliberate letters. Inside, he had written in his careful hand that the beans had come up strong and early and were already showing their second leaf set. He had written that Bramble had recovered fully from the winter illness and was back to her usual opinions. He had written that the drainage channel on the garden's west side had worked exactly as she had predicted, and the root vegetables were looking well. At the bottom of the letter he had written, very small, as if he had not been sure whether to include it, "I planted a row extra of everything, in case." She read that line 3 times. She folded the paper and put it with the first paper, both of them in the inner pocket of her cloak. She went to find her mother, who was at the market stall arguing cheerfully with a leather goods merchant about a badly stitched seam, and she stood at the edge of the argument waiting, and when Vesa finally prevailed and the merchant departed looking chastened, her mother turned to her and took one look at her face and said, without preamble, "You are going back." "I think so," Ursa said. "You think so," her mother repeated. "You have been here 2 months and you are sleeping like a woman with something on her mind, and you got a letter from a farmer, and now you are standing here looking like a person who has made a decision." "I have made a decision," she said. Vesa studied her. "He is good to you. He is good," she said. "That is the thing about him. He is genuinely, straightforwardly good. I keep waiting for there to be something else underneath it, and there is not." "Some people are like that," her mother said. "They are rare." She paused. "Your father was like that." Ursa did not say anything for a moment. Then quietly, "I know. Will I see you?" "Yes, I will come back for the autumn market, and I want you to come west and see the land. I think you will like it." Vesa made a sound that was entirely skeptical and then said, "I will come, if only to see for myself what manner of man has managed to get my daughter thinking about squash placement." Ursa laughed, and her mother looked at her with something soft and fierce in her expression, and they stood together in the market square for a moment in the morning light. She left the following week. The road west took 4 days again, the same roads, the same way stops, the same long evenings by fire, but everything felt different. She was moving toward something now rather than away from something, and the difference in her body was remarkable, a lightness in her step that she had not had going east, a restlessness that was anticipatory rather than uncertain. She came over the last rise above the valley on a late June afternoon, and the whole valley was spread below her, green and bright in the summer sun, and she could see from this height the small square of darker green that was Isaac's garden, vivid and well tended, laid out exactly as she had mapped it on his kitchen table in March. She stood on the rise and looked at it for a moment. She started walking. He was in the garden when she came through the field gate, crouched at the bean row doing something careful with his hands, and he did not hear her approach because Bramble was making her usual opinions known from the paddock and the wind was in the wrong direction, and she walked across his field toward him and felt something she was going to have to find words for. She stopped a few yards away. "The beans came up very well," she said. He went completely still. Then he stood and turned around and looked at her, and his face did the thing it did sometimes when his composure slipped just slightly, and underneath his composure was the full force of what he felt, unguarded and real, and she had been learning to read that face for months, and she read it clearly now. "You came back," he said. "I said I would think about it." "You did," he said. She walked the last few yards to him, close enough that she could see the summer sun had deepened the lines at the corners of his eyes and given him more color across his cheekbones, and he looked at her with those searching brown eyes, and everything he was feeling was completely legible to her, all of it, and she thought about the paper in her cloak pocket and the extra row of beans and said, "I thought about it." And he said very quietly, "I would like to stay," she said, "not as a guest. Not over winter because the road is closed. I would like to stay the way a person stays when they have decided that a place is where they belong." Something moved across his face that she had never seen before, a loosening of something that had been held very carefully for a very long time. "I would like that very much," he said. His voice was rough in the way of voices that are managing a strong feeling. "Very much." She reached out and took his hand, the rough, calloused hand that she had memorized over a winter's worth of evenings, and his fingers closed around hers, and they stood together in the garden in the June light with the beans growing strong on either side of them and everything else still ahead. He had planted a row extra of everything, in case. She thought about that as he held her hand in the summer garden, and she thought something that she had not let herself think before, something that she knew now was simply and thoroughly true. She thought, "I should have seen it in the way he walked out across that field to meet me in the dark." The summer was extraordinary in the way that summers are when everything that has been held at a careful distance is suddenly, gently, allowed to move closer. They rebuilt the roof properly, which was something the cabin had needed since before Ursa arrived. She found the problem sections with her hands, running her palm flat across the boards in the morning light, identifying the places where the ceiling had failed, and Isaac split new shingles from a good straight-grained cedar log while she stripped the compromised sections back. They worked together through 3 hot days, both of them up on the roof in the full sun, passing tools and materials and directions back and forth with the easy efficiency of people who had learned how the other moved. On the 3rd afternoon, the work mostly done, she sat back on the peak of the roof and looked out across the valley and the garden and the meadow beyond, and Isaac came and sat beside her, and they were both sweaty and wood-dusty and tired, and the valley was very beautiful in the afternoon light. He said, "I have been thinking." "You are always thinking," she said. "You are very quiet about it." "I have been thinking," he said again, patient, "that this place could be more than what it is. If someone were here year-round who knew what they were doing with a trade route." She looked at him. "You want to set up a trade post. Not a post exactly, a waypoint. For travelers coming through this valley, it is a good route underused because there is no reliable stop between the river settlement and the Clanhold roads." He paused. "You know both sides of that route." She was quiet, looking at the valley. "I have the land," he said. "The structure. I can build more if I need to." He paused. "And you know what people on both ends of that road need." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the valley with that focused, practical expression he wore when he was working through a problem, and she knew him well enough now to know that this was not just a practical proposal. He was building something. He was asking her to help him build it. He was doing what he had done all winter, extending a hand not as a demand but as an offering and leaving it entirely up to her what she did with it. "Half and half," she said. He looked at her. "What? If I put my trade knowledge and contacts into this with you, it is half and half. The business, not your farm, and my help, our enterprise." He considered this for a moment with the seriousness it deserved. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said, "half and half." She looked back at the valley. "My mother will want in on the eastern end." He made a sound that was very like trying not to smile. "I expected as much. She will also have opinions about the garden." I look forward to them, he said, and meant it. That autumn Ursa Ironblood came west on a trading wagon with two of the clanhold's other merchants, officially for the purpose of scouting a new western route, unofficially for the purpose of inspecting the human man her daughter had moved in with. Isaac met them at the valley road with Bramble and a cart, because the wagon was heavy and the last stretch of road was steep, and he had offered to help transfer the load before Ursa had fully introduced herself. Ursa watched him work for a while. She watched the way he moved around her daughter, not crowding, not performing, just present. She watched the way Ursa spoke to him, the shorthand they had already developed, the way they anticipated each other's needs without discussion. Later, helping Ursa in the kitchen while Isaac and the merchants worked outside, Ursa said simply, "Good." Ursa looked at her. "He is good," her mother said. "You were right." A pause. "The soil is also excellent." The trade waypoint opened the following spring and was an immediate and practical success. There was real need for a reliable stop on the valley route, as Isaac had anticipated, and what he had not fully anticipated was that a waypoint run by an orc woman with extensive clanhold contacts drew a more diverse clientele than he would have reached alone. Not just frontier settlers and traveling merchants, but orc clan traders who would not previously have had reason to stop in a human farmstead. This was not without friction. There were settlers in the valley and the river town to the south who had things to say about the kind of waypoint Isaac was running and the company his property was keeping. A man named Aldrich Holt from 2 farms over came by one morning with a face full of opinion and began to express it. And Isaac stood on his porch and listened with the patient courtesy. He offered everyone right up until the moment Holt made a specific comment about Ursa, at which point the patient courtesy went very quiet, and something behind Isaac's eyes went very still in a way that was not quiet at all. He said, in a voice so even it was almost more frightening than anger would have been, "You are standing on my land, Aldrich, and you are talking about my partner, and I am going to ask you once to consider very carefully what you say next." Holt said something else. Isaac said, "Then I think you should go." He said it the way he said everything, without drama, without performance, and it was final in the way that truly quiet things sometimes are. Holt went. Ursa had heard it from the far side of the garden where she had been working, and she had stood very still for a moment with her hands in the soil, and she had felt something move through her that she was only now beginning to understand was what it felt like to be defended by someone who did not need anything from the act. She had had people defend her before. Clan warriors, trading partners, people who had reason. Isaac defended her the way he had walked toward her across that field in the dark because he saw her clearly and what he saw was worth protecting, full stop. No more complicated than that, no less. She stood up from the garden and walked to the porch and leaned against the rail beside him and looked out at the road Holt had taken. "You did not need to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I can handle people like Holt." "I know you can," he looked at her. "I wanted to." She looked at him for a long moment. The summer was full and green around them, the garden heavy with the season, the waypoint building standing solid and new beside the original cabin. "Isaac," she said. "Yes." "I love you." She said it plainly in the way he had taught her to say things without softening or ceremony. "I need you to know that, in case I have not been making it obvious." He was very still for a moment. Then, slowly and completely, he smiled the way she had spent a year learning, the smile that started small and spread like thaw, unstoppable once it started. "You are not exactly making it obvious," he said. "I am making it obvious now." He reached out and took her hand, the green hand that had measured his garden rows with him and helped split cedar shingles and pressed bean seeds into window box soil, and he held it with both of his and he said, "I have loved you since you walked out of my trees in the autumn dark and let me take care of you." A pause. "Probably before that, if I am being honest. You cannot love someone before you have met them. I had been waiting for someone like you for a long time," he said. "When you arrived, it was like recognition." She looked at him for a long moment, and the summer afternoon was all around them, warm and full, and she thought about waiting for something, and not knowing what it was until it arrived. She leaned up and kissed him. He kissed her back with the same quality he brought to everything, total presence, no part of him somewhere else, and the porch rail was warm under her hand from the afternoon sun, and the garden smelled green and alive, and Bramble made an opinion from the paddock, and they ignored her. When they broke apart, he was still smiling. She thought she could live 100 years and not get tired of that smile. "Half and half," she said. He looked confused for a moment, and then he understood, and he laughed, which was also something she never got tired of, and she laughed too, and the valley stretched out before them full of summer. They were married the following year in the autumn, in a ceremony that was a compromise of both traditions and therefore somewhat idiosyncratic and entirely themselves. Vesa came west again, this time with a larger contingent from the clanhold, and Isaac's older brother Daniel came north from the river town, bringing his wife and their children, and the waypoint became for 3 days the most populated place in the valley, full of different languages and different customs and remarkable quantities of food. Daniel Keller was a careful man, older than his brother by 4 years and more formal in his manner, and Ursa had been prepared to manage his reservation. She was not prepared for the way he shook her hand on arrival and said, "Isaac wrote to us about you. All winter he wrote. We were beginning to wonder if you were real." She looked at Isaac, who had the expression he wore when he had done something he was mildly embarrassed about. "He wrote all winter," she said. Daniel looked between them. "He wrote a great deal," he said, with the particular tone of a brother who has stored up something useful. "Daniel," Isaac said. "He wrote that you knew where to put the squash," Daniel said. "I understood immediately that it was serious." The ceremony itself was brief and genuine. They stood in the garden, because it had seemed right, and an elder from Vesa's clanhold spoke the orc-binding words, and a traveling priest from the southern settlements spoke the human vows, and both of them spoke freely from their own hearts, which was not a normal part of either tradition, but was entirely right for them. Isaac said, in his careful way, that he had planted a garden for a spring she said she would not be there to see, and that the only thing in his life that had given him more joy than being wrong about that was the fact that she was standing in it with him now. He said it without performance or flourish, just the plain truth of it, and Vesa, who had excellent composure, was visibly moved. Ursa said that she had lived her whole life in motion, because she had not understood that the right place was a thing that could happen to you, and that he was the right place, and that she intended to keep moving as long as she lived, but she would always come back to him, because coming back to him was the most complete thing she had ever felt. There was a feast that lasted until very late. Bramble received special treatment from Vesa's contingent, one of whom was an animal trader with strong opinions about mules, and bore this attention with her customary contempt. The valley grew slowly more accustomed to what Isaac and Ursa were building, not all at once, and not without continued friction, because friction of that kind does not resolve all at once, but steadily, in the way that consistent and visible goodness tends to move through a community. The waypoint served people well. Ursa dealt fairly and without favoritism, and had a memory for what people needed, and a directness that people came to trust even when it was not what they wanted to hear. Isaac was the bedrock of the agricultural side of the valley, the person you went to when you needed to know about drainage or rot or late blight, and he gave his knowledge freely and his practical help even more freely, and between the two of them they had become, without quite intending to, the spine of something. Old Greta Harkness, who had been the first to open the spring road the year Ursa arrived, came by one late afternoon and sat on their porch and drank their tea and told Ursa, with the frankness of the very old, that when she had first heard a human man had moved an orc woman into his place, she had expected catastrophe. She said she had been wrong and that she was old enough to say so out loud. Ursa poured her more tea and said it was good to hear. Aldrich Holt moved away from the valley eventually, relocating to the river town for reasons he did not specify to anyone. Few in the valley seemed to find this a great loss. Their first child was born in the spring of their third year together, an event that was heralded by 3 weeks of Ursa's complete inability to be comfortable anywhere, and Isaac's calm and continuous presence through all 3 weeks without complaint. He had been quietly terrified, she knew, because she could read him as plainly as a page now, but he had not let the terror surface in any way that would add to her burden. He had simply been there, which was the thing he was best at in the world. The baby was a boy. He came into the world with his mother's dark green coloring and his father's earnest eyes, a combination that was arresting and entirely his own. They named him Bryn, which was an old word in the frontier tongue that meant broad or wide, because the first thing you noticed about him was how wide and alert his gaze was, taking everything in. Vesa arrived 2 weeks later and held her grandson and said nothing for a long time, and then said, into the top of his head, that he looked like a person who was going to know exactly where he wanted to be. "I wonder where he gets that," Isaac said, entirely without irony. Vesa looked at him. Then she looked at Ursa. Then she looked back at Bryn. "Good," she said, which was her word for things she approved of deeply. Bryn was followed 3 years later by a second child, a girl they named Sable, after the dark-furred pine marten whose territory included the north edge of their land, and who visited occasionally with a confidence that Ursa found personally relatable. Sable arrived already seeming to have opinions, a trait that manifested within her first weeks as a deeply communicative and unhappy response to anyone who underestimated her, and that her parents found simultaneously exhausting and magnificent. Daniel came north to meet his niece and nephew and spent a week, and helped Isaac put up the second trade building, which they had been needing for a year. His children played with Bryn in the garden, and Daniel's wife, a warm and sensible woman named Pell, sat with Ursa in the evenings and talked with an ease that made Ursa think that she had been right, years ago, to believe that the world contained more people capable of this kind of openness than the frightened voices would have her think. The waypoint grew. It had become, by Bryn's 5th year, a genuine stop on the valley route with a small attached trading room and a traveler's board that listed prices and availability of common goods. Vesa had formalized the Eastern connection, sending traders through reliably twice a season, and the route had developed a reputation for being safe and fairly priced. More travelers meant more income. More income meant they could afford to improve the property, and improve it they did, steadily and deliberately, adding rooms to the main structure, building a proper stable, improving the road that ran through their land. Isaac expanded the garden every year. This was a fact Ursa noticed with an amusement and tenderness that she did not always keep to herself. Every spring he went out with his knotted rope and his flat stones, and he measured new rows, a little further out, a little more ambitious. The year after Sable was born, he added a small orchard along the eastern fence, apple trees from cuttings he had obtained from a grower down the valley, and he planted each one with the focused care he brought to everything that mattered to him. Bryn helped plant the orchard, 5 years old and deeply serious about his role, tamping earth around each root ball with his small green hands. Isaac crouched beside him and showed him how to check the depth, and Bryn nodded with concentration, and Ursa watched them from the fence and felt, as she often did these days, something that she had once not had a word for and now knew completely. It was home. That was the word. She had found it in a field in the autumn dark, and it had turned out to be not a place but a person, and from that person had grown a place, and now the place and the person were so thoroughly woven together that she could not have said where one ended and the other began. She did not try. There was no reason to. The years moved through their seasons. The orchard grew and came into bearing, and the first year it produced real fruit. Isaac brought a basket of apples inside with an expression of such genuine delight that Bryn and Sable both caught it immediately and wanted to hold the apples, and the 4 of them stood in the kitchen examining the harvest like it was something impossible and wonderful, which Ursa thought it was. Everything that grew was. You put a seed in the earth and you tended it and you waited, and the earth gave you something back that you could hold in your hand. She had watched Isaac do this for years, and she still found it worth paying attention to. She said this to him that evening when the children were in bed and they were sitting by the fire, her feet up and her head against his shoulder, both of them tired in the good way that came at the end of a full day. "I find it worth paying attention to," she said, "the growing things." He was quiet for a moment, his hand moving slowly through her hair. "I know," he said, "you always have." "I think it is what convinced me," she said. He shifted slightly to look down at her. "The garden, not only the garden." She looked at the fire. "The fact that you planted it, you had heard what I said, I know you had. And you went out and you planted a garden for a spring you could not be certain I would be there to see." She paused. "That was a very specific kind of faith." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I have thought about why I did that many times. I think it was the only thing I knew how to say. It was the right thing to say. It was also just the truth," he said. "I needed to plant the garden. The garden needed planting, and I wanted you to be here to see it grow." She turned her head and looked at him, at the face she knew as well as her own now. The quiet brown eyes and the smile lines and the gray that had begun at his temples, giving him a new gravity she found entirely appealing. "Isaac," she said, "yes, I am very glad I came back." He looked at her for a long moment, and everything he felt was completely visible to her because she had learned to read him absolutely, and what she read was so full and so honest that it filled the whole room. "I am very glad you came back too," he said. He kissed the top of her head. She settled back against his shoulder. The fire burned low and even, and outside the window the frontier night was full of the sounds of things alive and growing, and Bramble was long gone by now, peacefully elderly and well tended to the end, and there was a new mule in the stable named Flint who had a more cooperative temperament, and who Bryn had already claimed as his particular companion. The waypoint hummed along outside, quiet for the night. The orchard trees stood dark shapes in the yard. The garden rows were put to bed under their autumn covering, waiting for spring. Spring would come. It always did. And with it the knotted rope and the flat stones and the measuring of new rows, a little further out, a little more ambitious, the way it went every year. She had told him she would leave come spring. He had started planting a garden like he hadn't heard a word of it. It was the best thing anyone had ever done for her. The 10th year of their life together brought a particular kind of beauty that Ursa recognized as the beauty of things that have been tended long enough to become what they were always meant to be. The property was no longer a single man's frontier farm. It was a working enterprise, a waypoint, a home with rooms for guests and a trading floor that had seen merchants from as far east as the deep clan holds and as far south as the coastal ports. The garden had become a small farm in its own right, supplying the waypoint's kitchen and generating a surplus that they traded along the route. Bryn was 10 years old and had his mother's height already, promised to be taller than either of his parents. With his father's quiet, observant nature combined with his mother's directness, in a way that was going to be interesting to watch. He was reading everything he could lay his hands on. The same worn frontier stories his father had, the trading records his mother kept, the surveying manuals and the farming guides, all of it indiscriminately, with the same wide, alert gaze he had come into the world with. Sable was 7 and already running the junior end of the kitchen operation, with a confidence that made the waypoint's occasional hired help slightly nervous. She had her mother's build, solid and powerful, and her father's composure, which on a 7-year-old was either deeply funny or slightly unnerving depending on the circumstance. She had also claimed the apple orchard as her particular territory and spent considerable time in it, and the trees seemed to respond to her attention, which Isaac said was not scientifically possible and which happened anyway. Vesa came twice a year now, regular as the seasons. She had a standing arrangement with Isaac that she would have opinions about the garden, and he would listen to them respectfully, and then do mostly what he had already planned, and they both seemed satisfied with this arrangement. She had also, over the years, developed a genuine and openly expressed affection for him that she delivered in the orc custom of practical endorsement. She recommended him to people, talked about his land, and sent him good seed varieties she came across in her trading, which he received with the seriousness due a significant gift. Daniel and Pell came north every other summer, and their children and Bryn and Sable had the comfortable ease of cousins who have known each other since infancy, different enough to be interesting and similar enough to be close. Pell had once said to Ursa over wine late in a summer evening that she thought what Isaac and Ursa had built was the most sensible thing she had seen in years, and that she meant sensible as the highest compliment. "It is," Ursa had said. "It is very sensible." "Most love stories are not this sensible," Pell said. Ursa considered this. "I think it was sensible because we were both honest," she said. "He was honest about what he wanted. I was honest about what I needed. We gave each other both." Pell raised her cup. "To honesty," she said. "To honesty," Ursa agreed. The valley itself had changed. There were more homesteads now, the roots growing reputation pulling new settlers, and a few of them had come specifically because they had heard that the Keller waypoint was a fair and open stop regardless of who you were. There was a mixed family 3 farms north, a human woman and her orc husband, who had come through as travelers and been treated so plainly and normally that they had decided the valley was a possible place to try. There was a family of half-orcs from the southern settlements who had been moving steadily north, looking for somewhere the children would not be pointed at, and who had stopped and stayed. The valley was not perfect because nowhere is, but it had a character now, a particular quality of welcome that had started from a single cabin with a leaking roof and a man who walked toward strangers in the dark. Ursa was aware of this. She was aware that the thing she and Isaac had built together was larger than the two of them, that it had sent roots out into the valley and changed the quality of the soil, so to speak. She was not a person who was comfortable with sentiment about her own life, but she was honest enough to sit with this truth on the porch in the evenings, watching the valley fill with its summer color, and acknowledge it. She had been leaving come spring. He had planted a garden. Bryn asked her about it once, the way children ask about the stories they have heard too many times to not want the real version, sitting beside her on the porch on an autumn evening when the light was that deep amber that the valley got in the last weeks before the first frost. "Is it true," he said, "that you told Papa you were leaving and he went out and started planting a garden?" "Yes," she said. "Why did he do that?" She thought about how to explain this to a 10-year-old with his father's earnest eyes. "Because he hoped," she said, "hoped that you would stay. Hoped that there was something worth planting for," she said, "whether I stayed or not. He could not make me stay, he would not have tried to, but he could choose to believe that the future was worth planting for." She paused. "That is a kind of courage, to keep tending things when you do not know the outcome." Bryn was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden, which was going golden at the edges now, winding down toward its winter rest. "I want to be like that," he said. She put her arm around her son's shoulders, broad and solid already, a good strong young body, half of his father and half of her and entirely his own. "You already are," she said. "You come by it honestly." Isaac came out onto the porch then, the way he always did in the evenings, with 2 cups of tea, and the look he got when the day was done, and the family was gathered and everything was right, and he handed Ursa her cup and sat on the other side of Bryn and looked out over the garden. Sable came barreling out behind him, having gotten her hands on a piece of the apple cake that was cooling in the kitchen, and not particularly concerned about whether this had been authorized. And she distributed herself between both parents in the easy way of a child who has never been uncertain of her welcome. And the 4 of them sat on the porch in the amber autumn evening and watched the light go down over the valley. The garden was deep gold and dark green, full and heavy with the last of the season, the rows laid out exactly as she had once mapped them on a kitchen table in March with a piece of charcoal, and a great deal of uncertainty about what she was doing. The beans were on the eastern side. The squash had morning light and afternoon shade. The root vegetables ran along the back where the drainage channel did its quiet work. There was a row extra of everything. There always was. Isaac reached across the back of the bench and took her hand, the same way he had in the garden that first June, and she folded her fingers through his, and the valley turned amber and deep blue below them, and the waypoint was quiet for the evening, and somewhere in the graywood something owlish made its opinion known and went back to its own business. She had told him she would leave come spring. He had planted a garden. She had come back to find it growing. And all of it, every season of it, every row and every root and every apple on every tree in the young orchard, all of it had grown from that. A man walking toward her without fear in the autumn dark, and a woman deciding slowly and with great stubbornness and absolute certainty that she had found the right place. This was it. This was the right place. And the spring would come again, and with it the knotted rope and the new rows further out, more ambitious, the way it always was, the way it would always be. Home.